The advice and opinions expressed by Dr. Granpeesheh and her guests are meant solely as suggestion and should not be in any way construed as child-specific advice.
Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh is
Dr. Doreen is an expert in autism.
Doreen Granpeesheh.
Dr. Granpeesheh.
Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh.
Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh is a visionary in the field of autism. Now you can ask her questions on Ask Dr. Doreen. Good morning and welcome to Ask Dr. Doreen. Don't adjust your sets. We have not gone back to 2022 or 2020. We are doing this restream because we're still setting up our new studio. We can't wait to unveil that to you. But I'm Shannon Penrod and I am here with the fabulous, the wonderful Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh. Good morning, Dr. Granpeesheh.
Good morning, Shannon, and hello, everyone.
We're so thrilled to have all of you here. I want you guys to know that the chat is now open and Dr. Granpeesheh and I can see it. So if you guys want to be writing it in, this is a live show. I know there's been some confusion lately because we pre-taped a lot of shows, but this is a live show. The date today, I have no idea what the date is today. Where on my screen does it say? Oh, it's the 6th. It's the day after Cinco de Mayo. Somebody told me today is Revenge of the Sith Day. I don't know. Every day in May it has a day. So anyway, because we had May the 4th, now it's Revenge of the Sith. Okay. But we're here. We are live. We're taking your questions. We're live right now on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and about a dozen other sites. And our fabulous Chris Desmond is showing you some of the different ways that you can connect with us live, but also some of the ways that you can connect with us later in the day. Listen, we know you're busy and you have a lot of things to do, and that many of you, your preferred method of joining us is via podcast, audio only. We are available wherever you get your podcasts, and it is a free download for you, which is a pretty amazing thing. We've been doing this for over 14 years. But don't forget that we also have two robust YouTube channels. I want to direct all of you to go to the YouTube channel Ask Dr. Doreen, where you can be watching all the amazing work that she's been doing over the last 14 years. Pretty incredible. And search topics and see what she has had to say on other things. But if you can't find your answer, of course, we want you to come when we're doing it live and ask your question in the chat starting right now. I also want to let you know that for those of you who are listening in podcast, you will, as I said, it's a free download for you, which means that you will likely get an ad or two while you're listening. And I hope you embrace that and go, thank you to those sponsors for paying so I don't have to. But some of you, that's not your cup of tea. That's okay. If you would prefer to have it ad free, we have a way for you to do that. It's a very small monthly cost, $5 a month. All you have to do is go to glow.fm/autism-live. When you pay that $5, you get everything that we do at the Autism Network. That includes Autism Live, Ask Dr. Doreen, and absolutely every new show that we do will show up in your inbox ad-free, which is pretty incredible for $5 a month. So check that out. I believe I've said everything except the disclaimer, which is very important because even though Dr. Granpeesheh is a true expert in this field of autism, I believe the expert in our time on the subject of autism and things related to it. There is no one, including Dr. Granpeesheh, that can give individual specific advice in this particular format. If you think about it, it just wouldn't be fair to the person, right? Because she doesn't have eyes on the situation. It's not fair to expect her to give individual specific advice either. However, what we have learned over 14 years is there's so much to be learned through telling her what's going on, picking her brain, her asking you more questions, and discussing the subject and getting a broader view on it. So many of you have written in and said it's been transformative. So we hope that you will give us information about what's going on for you. We love it when you tell us where you're watching from. I am geographically challenged, so we don't need your address, right? But we just want to know what the closest major city is. So we might be able to tell you about resources that we could be aware of that are close to you, because it's still not a level playing field. It's different wherever you are. So I think I've gotten to everything. Our topic today is diagnosis, which is a very broad topic. And you guys have written in some questions. Before I launch in, Dr. Granpeesheh, is there anything you wanted to add before I start? I just talk.
No, that's wonderful. No, nothing to add. I'm sure we'll get into the diagnosis and all those things that go with it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, let's launch in. Uh, One of our first questions, my son's preschool has recommended that I take him to be evaluated for autism, but they couldn't give me a place to go. Where do I go do this? Who does it and what does it cost?
Yeah. That's, uh, so always, of course, you can start by looking at your insurance. So you could begin by checking your providers on your insurance that are in network with your medical insurance, and you would be looking for either a licensed clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a developmental pediatrician. Those are actually psychologists and developmental pediatrician are probably the most common folks who do diagnose. And then some psychiatrists also do. Some don't feel comfortable with it, but others do. So you should probably call ahead once you've found those folks and make sure that they do actually feel comfortable diagnosing autism. And that's it. And then you go in and or you can also do this via telehealth, but essentially you'd be filling out some questionnaires which are actually standardized tests and answering a lot of questions about your child. And then the individual who's doing the diagnosis will uh, observe your child a little bit. So your child needs to be present, whether on Zoom or in person, and will ask you a lot more questions. And then they will identify whether or not your child qualifies for the diagnosis.
And thank you for saying to start with your insurance. I got to be honest, my son was diagnosed so long ago now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was almost 20 years ago at
Yeah.
this point. And I didn't know what to do, but somebody said, call your insurance. At the time we were with Kaiser, and they said, call and make an appointment for an evaluation with a developmental pediatrician. And I didn't realize for years how much time and money that saved me.
Mhm.
Because later on, when we were talking about, there was a moment when we were being encouraged to get a corroborating diagnosis. And then I started calling around to different places, and the waiting lists were insane then. Now they're worse. And the cost was high. So I really appreciate that somebody told me and that you're telling people start with your insurance and see what is possible. Um,
Yeah, and to answer that question about the cost of this, which was the second part of the question, uh, when a clinician does a diagnosis, they don't need to do a whole battery of tests. Like when I do a diagnosis, I might have one questionnaire filled out. I've been doing diagnoses for I don't know, like 30 years. So it's very easy for me to meet with an individual and have a bunch of questions answered, and then I can actually say whether or not the diagnosis exists. I don't need the testing. Some payers, insurance companies, just a few of them, not all of them, a few of them require testing, and that can be one test. There are certain tests that are specifically intended for diagnosis. For example, the GARS, which is the Gilliam Autism Rating Schedule, or the CARS. There are several short questionnaires that assist with diagnosis. There are some really intense tests that are absolutely not necessary, that are kind of the gold standard when it's necessary, but no one requires these. That would be the ADOS or the ADIR. These are very, very lengthy, time consuming, difficult, and costly. So basically, the more time a diagnostician spends on assessments, the more the cost of the diagnosis. So if you go in and you see, let's say, a psychologist, or the psychologist has experience and says, okay, I'm going to spend a couple of hours with you and your child, and I'm going to identify whether or not your child meets the criteria for diagnosis, that will probably cost, I would say, less than $400. But if you end up doing a full assessment, it could be closer to $4,000 or $5,000. So that's what you need to clarify. And there's two reasons. I mean, so let me just also back up on that. If the evaluations and assessments that are done during diagnosis, like an ADOS, for example, they're not going to tell you anything about the level of. Oh, no, let me back up. They're not going to tell you much about what your child actually needs, like their skills and their areas of deficiency and what to do next, and nothing like that. They're just going to give you a diagnosis, and they're going to tell you the level of severity. And when I say level of severity, that has to do with the amount of support your child requires in each of the areas of the diagnosis. So would you end up, even if you do a $5,000 assessment, what you'll end up walking away with is a diagnosis and two numbers. Hopefully they'll give you two numbers. One number has to do with the amount of support your child needs in the area of social and communication, and the second number has to do with the amount of support your child needs in the area of what we call stereotypy or repetitive behaviors. And that's about it. That's what you're going to walk away from with. So that's why I often, when I do diagnosis, the main reason that I would do diagnosis is to help someone begin therapy, because you do need a diagnosis in order to gain access to services after that, right? So treatments that are covered by your health insurance. I try to keep it as short as possible because it is costly for the family, and I want to move forward. It's not about whether, like the detail of the diagnosis so much as it is about the detail of assessing the child after the diagnosis to see what skill areas and what areas of deficits they have.
And we have a lot of questions that are about some of the things that you just said. So I'm
Great.
gonna hold off on some of that, but I want to get to this next question because this is something that we've seen a lot of in this last year.
Okay.
My daughter was given a provisional diagnosis from the regional center during the pandemic. They didn't even look at her. They asked me questions. They gave us 36-hour program, which we did. For 2 years, she made tremendous progress. At the end of the second year, they evaluated her in person and said she doesn't qualify for a diagnosis. They wouldn't pay for our services anymore. This was a year ago or so. She was doing so much better that we just let it go. Now we have seen regression. Do I need to get an independent diagnosis? She started school, but they won't give her an IEP, and things just seem to be getting out of control. What do you recommend? This has been a very common tale that the provisional diagnosis got kids services, but then as a result, they got enough better that the regional center said you don't need anything while they were in the middle of their intervention. It's heart-wrenching. What do you recommend for this family?
It's very upsetting when I hear things like this, Shannon, because the provisional diagnosis it's an internal dialogue with amongst the clinicians. In other words, we're just not sure what's going on, but you never release a provisional diagnosis and let it be for a couple of years. Like a provisional diagnosis is something that needs yet to be solved. So essentially, what should have happened in this case is that they should have administered something like the ADOS. If there's any question at all about whether or not this individual has a diagnosis, that question should have been cleared up. And there are lots of ways to clear that up, right? So that should have happened before anything else.
This was the Band-Aid. Excuse me 1 second. This was the Band-Aid that the regional center did during COVID because they didn't want to have kids coming in. That was why.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I was like, why would they release a provisional diagnosis? Makes no sense. So that makes sense. It's still a little idiotic, to be honest, because you don't require, they could have done a lot of things. They could have sent questionnaires to the parents to fill out and then receive them back in the mail and then done the diagnosis. It's silly to leave it there. I think it was just a Band-Aid. What that said, it's just also the next step of weird is that you actually got services with a provisional diagnosis. Normally you wouldn't. The third area of weird is that now they're trying to come back and say, okay, the services were done and your child actually doesn't have it. It's just the whole thing is a mess.
Yeah.
So I would definitely go back and I would, at this point, definitely get in touch and try to get a diagnosis. Don't use them. Go through your health insurance if you can. Even if you have Medicaid, you're going to get coverage for this. And just start with a fresh pair of eyes. You do not need to go into history. You can just go, because history tends to, make people think different things or influence their decision. Just go in and say, hey, I have been told that my child might have autism. Could you please do an evaluation? And have them do an evaluation and clarify it once and for all. The fact that you're not able to get an IEP goes back to not having the full diagnosis. That provisional is not going to fly anywhere. So basically, getting a diagnosis is your first step.
There we go. I love that. Cutting right to the chase there.
It's just such nonsense that there's so many lies, that are told to parents that it just disturbs me.
Well, the thing that was good about it was that they allowed them to get services, because
Yeah,
we had kids that were waiting, and it was like, well, what are you going to wait for? You can't because of COVID say they can't get treated or get assessed. But it's been a hot mess the last year as they've gone back and reevaluated all those kids. And anyway, I want to say hi to Nicholas. Nicholas, we're so happy that you're watching. Good morning. I hope you're doing well. I also want to get to, this is a very charged one. You and I spoke about this briefly. Why isn't there a designation adult diagnosed autism? I don't want to take anything away from these folks, but they seem to have more and more of the spotlight, and their brand of autism is not what my child has experienced. It's totally different. So they would like to know your point of view on that, Dr. Granpeesheh.
Yeah. So my thinking on this is that if you are an individual who has never been diagnosed and now you are an adult and now you are seeking out diagnosis, or someone has diagnosed you as an adult. And remember, Shannon, a lot of people don't even have a formal diagnosis and they say, I think I have autism.
Yeah.
So there's that too. But if you are diagnosed in adulthood, this very clearly means that the level of severity of your autism is low. You do not have the classic or severe form of autism, because if you did, it would have been noticed and a lot of concern would have happened when you were 2, not when you're an adult. So the adult thing goes hand in hand with severity. If you're being diagnosed now, you most likely have what in the old days, before Diagnostic Manual 5, was referred to as either Asperger's or PDD-NOS, which means you are minimally affected by the symptom characteristics of autism. So that then takes us to a whole nother, I guess, debate or disagreement or thing that everyone needs to pay attention to, which is there's a huge difference between someone who is an adult who's having a lot of social issues, let's say, and they don't know exactly how to establish a romantic relationship or, maintain friendships or that type of thing. And someone who is an adult who was diagnosed when they were a child, who is still in diapers because they're not potty trained, cannot communicate at all, perhaps overnight feces smears, is severely aggressive because they're very frustrated, and that's autism too. So in my mind, the biggest issue, and when you remember, Shannon, when the Diagnostic Manual 5 came out back in 2013, I actually thought this is nice for people who have Asperger's because it actually provides health insurance coverage for them. Before the DSM-5, Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified, were separate from autism. Autism had its own diagnosis and they were separate. And if you did not have a diagnosis of autism itself, if you had Asperger's or PDNOS, you couldn't get insurance coverage. If you remember, you could only get it with a pure diagnosis of autism. When DSM-5 happened, all of these came under one umbrella called the autism spectrum disorders, right? It's a spectrum now, and they all fell in there. And for people who are on the higher levels who needed a little bit of help, it was a wonderful thing because now health insurance started to give them that little bit of help, right? What I didn't predict was that, so many years later, these individuals and their functioning and their lives would influence what happens to the individuals who are more severe. That to me is just not right. It's not fair. There are individuals who are very severely affected by autism. They really, really need support and help, very likely lifetime support and help. And it's not fair to them, and it's also not fair to their parents or families who are currently being refused services. And the more individuals who are, at the top of the spectrum, the folks who are only affected in terms of, let's say, social or, theory of mind, perspective taking, very, very subtle sort of cognitive elements of autism. When these folks say, we don't need any help, we want to be accepted the way we are, that totally makes sense. But it doesn't make sense for these severe folks. And while it's one spectrum, it's not helpful to the folks who really do need help. Does that make sense, Shannon? I don't know, I kind of went off on a segue, but that was
No, it makes total sense. I mean, I'm just going to say this was a bumpy April. We had, all different types of people in the autism community kind of having their feelings hurt. I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to take a one case scenario. If you guys are watching The Last of Us, right? Great program on HBO. And Bella Ramsey, who is an amazing actress, amazing young actress, has let us all know, and I appreciated it so much that during the season 1 filming, one of I think it was a makeup person who said something to her because she was having lots of sensory, excuse me, I should say they were having lots of sensory issues. And the makeup person said, "Oh, I have a family member like that. Are you on the spectrum?" And it was the first time that it had come up, but then some research was done and that individual went and got the diagnosis and has really been a champion for the cause recently and talking about how it informs their acting and how, she's really they are really embracing it. And, this is a wonderful thing, except that on the other side, we've had so many people who are like, that's great. That's wonderful. And I don't want to take anything away from Bella and bless them for speaking out and saying how positive they're taking of this and embracing it. But it isn't helpful to the people that are, as you said, still requiring the level of support that is really intensive. And it's sort of this flip. It's the pendulum. For so long, people saw the movie Rain Man and thought that everybody with autism was Rain Man.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've opened it up to say that there are lots of different, but it seems like except for Love on the Spectrum, we only have the people who have the capability of communicating, having the mic, and the people who don't have the ability to say something into a mic, not getting the coverage,
not having a voice.
Yes,
and you're absolutely right. That is exactly the way I look at it as well. And it's funny because you and I have not really talked about our opinions of this because we haven't had a chance to last month, but we both come from exactly the same place, and that's because we've been in this world for such a long time, and we've seen the huge spectrum, right? And it is just, I will fight for the rest of my life for those people who are severely affected, period. Not to say that I don't care about individuals who are minimally affected. Of course I do. And of course I've helped many of them in many ways that I can of my whole life. but the ones that are severely affected don't have a voice in this. And that's what's really, really unfair. It's unfair. It's not right.
And I will say too, um, I don't want to speak for them, but I have many friends who are parents of these individuals that don't have a voice for themselves, and I see how debilitating it is for them because not only are they trying to be the voice for their child, but they also take criticism about not allowing their child to be a voice for themselves and then have to re-explain over and over, my child does not have the capability to speak for themselves. And on many different levels. It's not just about vocal, it's about, as you said, cognition and understanding and advocating for themselves. It's a
Yeah,
tough call. And it's a beautiful spectrum. And I think there's room for
absolutely.
all of us.
100%. But I don't think the world realizes. I just got a text the other day from a friend who doesn't know a lot about autism, but just knows that my life is about autism. And I think he sent a text, and it was a very young man who was, I think, testifying in Congress, and he was speaking about kind of how we individuals with autism feel that we are not broken and that we should not be classified as having a problem and all that sort of stuff. And I'm listening to this young man and I'm thinking, what a brilliant young man. He's so young, right? This little kid. I don't know his age exactly, but he was very eloquent and speaking about this. And I was thinking to myself, how wonderful that he has a voice and he's so representative of the individuals who are minimally affected. And then what came to my mind was my dear friend who is a very influential parent in autism legislation and health insurance and so on, and how her daughter, for the longest period of time, was someone who would smear feces on the walls every single night, no matter what we did, behaviorally training the parents and the quality of life that they all had to give up in order to kind of get through that phase. Not to mention that years later, that same daughter who is severely affected by autism was sexually molested by a teacher because she couldn't tell anyone that this kind of thing was happening. Or the young man who we both know who died in a fire with his mother because he was so terrified of the fire alarm that he wouldn't leave the house. I mean, these are instances of individuals who need help,
Yeah.
and if we just say, oh, let's accept the way that things are, these individuals are harmed in life.
Yeah.
And so we have to separate this out and we have to say, when you need help, it is not about being accepted. Everyone is accepted. When you need help, you should have access to that help. It's really that simple.
I want to say hi to Rodney and Carl and Rosie. We thank you all for being there. Carl had said talk more about this, and then you did. So I hope we've met your requirement, Carl. Love to know your opinions because it's I know every this really is about the perspective taking, right? And you've taught me more than anybody else about perspective taking. And perspective taking means that we understand that how we see it is not how everybody else sees it. So we'll make room for that here, and if you have thoughts you guys can feel free to write in. I want to get back to some of our questions about diagnosis, but you guys can be writing in questions. We're taking live questions right now. I want to get to this next question, but my screen's being funny for me. Hang on one second. I've heard you talk about the two numbers in a diagnosis. We just got my son's report and he is a 2-1. Can you
Great.
help me to understand what that means?
That's fantastic. I'm so glad that you got the two numbers. There are two domains or areas that are covered when you're looking at a diagnosis. The first area is called social communication. And social communication there's three different subclassifications in that domain. The first one is abnormal social approach or failure of normal back and forth conversation. So, in other words, that would be one symptom if your child not doesn't have the normal level of back and forth conversation that they should have for their age. Now, remember this very different if you're a 3-year-old or a 10-year-old, right? So they're not able to converse with friends the way that a peer would. That would be one. The second symptom under which the one of the first domains, social communication, are things like nonverbal communication. So the individual does not have the typical level of eye contact or standing distance from others or those types of things. The third area would be developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. So these are just three sub-symptoms under that one domain called social communication. Your child receives a 2 in that area, severity. That means they're right in the middle. There's a rating severity of 1, 2, or 3. 1 means the individual needs very minimal support. 2 means they need support, and 3 means they need extreme amounts of support. So if your child receives a 2, that means they're right in the middle. They need some support, but that means think of it as they're kind of affected in the social communication area on the average, like just about, sort of in the middle of that area, of that domain. The second domain is what's called restricted repetitive patterns of behavior or interests or activities. And these include a variety of different symptoms, so that second domain. So there's things like stereotypic behavior, like body rocking, hand flapping, lining up their objects, staring at things from the corner of their eyes, those stereotypies. That's one area. Another area that could classify in here is insistence on sameness, insisting on routines, being very upset if things are changed. Another area is having very, very fixated interests. So, someone who, let's say, wants to only talk about geography, or they've memorized all the various, logarithms and things like that. The fourth area would be sensory hyperactivity or hyper-responsivity to sensory stimuli. So there's these 4 areas that fall into the second domain, which is the repetitive, fixated repetitive behaviors. Now, if you have a 1 in that area, that means your child is minimally affected in this area. So for your child, they're kind of average affected in the first domain, which is social communication, and they're minimally affected in the second domain, which is the repetitive behaviors. So that's how you interpret those numbers. 1 is very mild, 2 is kind of average, and 3 is very severe.
Thank you for that. And one of the things that we have seen over and over and over again is that people write in and tell us just one number. And I know that makes you itchy.
Yeah, it's funny, Shan, it's become so commonplace that if you look it up, you'll get one number, because now it's becoming like one of those things, like how we refer to tissue as Kleenex.
Right.
Kleenex is a brand. So but it's just over time definitions change. You should be getting two numbers. And let me tell you the why. This is kind of what's very, very important, I think. Imagine a child who is classified as a 1-3 versus a child who's classified as a 3-1. Let's talk about those two for a minute. A child who's a 1-3 is someone who has language, because remember, they're very minimally affected in the area of social communication. That's a 1. But they're very severely affected in the area of restricted repetitive behaviors. That means they have language, they're communicative with people, but they have some of those like very intense reactions when their transitions change or their routines change, and they have kind of almost like obsessive compulsive type stuff. That's that child. What's a 3-1? A 3-1 child is someone who has no language. They don't have communication ability. They're very affected in the area of social communication, but they don't really struggle very much from, let's say, the repetitive behaviors. Do you see how different those two individuals are? And when we don't get the two numbers, they're being seen as the same. That's what's very upsetting. That's why those two numbers matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything in between. I mean,
Yes.
I love that you showed us, so clearly. And I hope that those of you who know people on the spectrum, you kind of got like an idea in your head of, okay, well, so who would that, 1 3B, because I think we all know some people who seem very, very, very capable and they can talk and talk and talk, but like, if they are not able to do a ritual that they're able to do, there's a meltdown and they can't function.
Yeah.
And that's a very specific treatment, a very specific path. But likewise,
Very
unfortunately,
different path than a 3-1. Very different path than a 3-1.
but on the other side, I think we've all met children, unfortunately. I don't know, maybe some of you haven't been exposed to a child who has little to no communication skills whatsoever, but maybe doesn't have that sensory sensitivity and doesn't have the repetitive.
Right.
A very, very different child, and your path as a clinician of what you would do to help them, polar opposite.
Exactly.
So I think it's sort of unconscionable, Dr. Granpeesheh, that this new DSM-5 was put out, and I know that there was training for clinicians, but where did this 2-number thing get lost? I've been saying to people, if you pay for a diagnosis and you don't get 2 numbers, go back and tell them you need 2 numbers, because people are paying thousands of dollars for these diagnoses and not having it done properly. Do you have thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, it's funny, Jan, because even in the diagnostic manual itself, the beginning of that chapter, there's an entire section on the 2 numbers. There's a whole section on how you actually apply these numbers. So for clinicians who are giving these diagnoses, if they're giving you one number, they haven't even read the chapter on the diagnosis.
That's
So
mind-boggling.
yeah.
That is mind-boggling. Okay, speaking of the DSM-5, do you think the DSM-5 needs to be changed to better diagnose girls, or do you think the diagnosticians are the problem and they need to be better trained?
Yeah, I don't think that you can change the diagnostic manual whenever there's a gender effect. There are gender effects in a lot of the mental disorders, a lot. So the individual who's diagnosing just needs to take that into consideration. Anxiety is one of those where there's a very significant gender effect. Whenever there's anxiety in females, it is more likely to lead to very reclusive type behavior, whereas when there's anxiety in males, it is much more likely to reflect in sort of aggressive behaviors. One is internal, one is external. So there's gender effects in a lot of different things, and clinicians just need to be cautious and take that into consideration. When I went through the DSM and I talked to you guys about the kind of the subsections and the domains and all that sort of stuff, what I didn't say, which I should say, is that there are other criteria, I guess. The 2 that I went through are domain 1 and domain 2. There's 3 other things that have to happen in order to get a diagnosis. And those 3 things, what's interesting is they apply to a lot of other disorders as well. So I kind of want to just mention those 3 things.
Sure.
The first one, which is criteria 3 or C, is that symptoms have to be present in early development, but they can become very fully manifested later in life depending on the stressors. So in other words, when you see something that's going on, let's say the individual you were just talking about, and they're saying, hey, I feel like a lot of, sensory type issues bother me a lot. You have to ask, was that always present in your life? And if it's only just becoming apparent to you now because you're a public figure, for example.
Right.
So these symptoms cannot have just become apparent later in life. Like they could have, depending on your stressors, but they have to have some early developmental connection. So that's number 1. The second one is, this is a big one, and this is one I always talk about with people, and here it is. I'm going to read it verbatim, okay? Symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. Here we go again. Symptoms must cause a clinically significant impairment.
Yeah.
So, and that the reason I reiterate this is because I have so many people coming to see me who really might have some form of social issue or other type of thing going on. But when we're talking about autism or ASD, there has to be a very clinically significant impairment in occupational, social, or other important areas of life. This criteria, by the way, applies to almost all of the disorders that are in the DSM.
Yeah.
Unless there's some clinical significance that is affecting your life, it's not a disorder. Okay,
Right.
that's really important. And then the last criteria is that these disturbances, these issues are not better explained by something else, such as intellectual disability or global developmental delay or anything else, ADHD or whatever else. So that of course applies to all disorders. Like if there's a better description of it somewhere else, then it's more likely that than this. But these are important distinctions as well when it comes to the diagnosis. So I just wanted to make sure our folks all know that.
Yeah. I think that the one that you elucidated so carefully, I think it's a tripwire. I'll say this, that when our son was diagnosed, I really didn't know that much about autism, and I was like, what is it exactly? And I was asking everybody, and as people were describing symptoms, both my husband and I went, oh, I feel like I fit that description, right?
Yep.
Um, but
Yeah.
but this is the litmus test, not to the point where, like, we all have, well,
Exactly. I was good. Thank you for saying that. Go ahead. Keep going.
but some of us, a lot of us have social anxiety,
Yeah.
right? And I do. Oh, I really do. Everybody thinks I'm such a loudmouth, but I have sometimes really what I feel like, and the word I would use is crippling, but I can still make myself do it and I can get through it and I don't have to be hospitalized afterwards.
Right.
So let's be honest about that. Even though I feel and I describe it as crippling, I have found the path through it for myself. So
Yes.
I would not qualify for a diagnosis.
That's right. And you can apply exactly what you just said, Shannon, to a lot of other diagnoses as well. Talk about ADHD, for instance. You can have all of us do these days, especially with everything that's in our food and dyes and whatever, and phones and all the electromagnetic fields and all that. A lot of us have a lot of distractibility. A lot of us have a hard time with attention. A lot of people do, right? But you still won't qualify for a diagnosis because we get through it. It is not debilitating. It is not causing clinically significant impairment in one area of our life. And so we get through it. We may not be 100%, but we're able to get through it. And that's what you were referring to is really the kind of murky line, I guess.
Yeah.
Because the ability to get through these things is different by person, for each person, right? So as a person, let's say I might wake up in the morning and have a headache. And either I will classify that as something I'm just going to cope with and go through the rest of my day, or I will classify it as something very scary and, oh my God, what's going on with me, and I'll stay in bed. And the decision is really kind of an internal decision of how we describe it, how we experience it, all of that. You know what I mean? And so something that for me might not be cause clinical impairments might cause for someone else. And all that means is that someone else, will now be eligible to receive help. And that's very important for people to understand why we classify, like a lot of people, like you said, have anxiety. That doesn't mean they're going to get the diagnosis of anxiety. But if they go and they describe their anxiety in a very severe way, because that's how they really feel, they will get the diagnosis of anxiety, because a lot of the stuff in the DSM is based on symptoms. It's not based on a blood test. It's not based on, let me look at your hormones. It's based on symptoms. And how do we get symptoms? It's how you describe them.
Yeah.
How you describe them is how you experience them. And that's really, really important. And so We have to keep all of that in mind, which is why it's important to see clinicians
Yeah.
who take a little bit of time and have the experience to ask you all of these questions, right? And to understand really where you're coming from.
Well, and I'm going to take that and go back to the question about girls and women being
Yeah,
diagnosed
there you go.
because I feel like that dovetails right into it. That a lot of the criticism is that women are sometimes, not always, let's not overgeneralize, but sometimes women are more adaptable, even though they're having these issues, they're more adaptable, which then means they don't get the diagnosis because they're not conveying what the symptoms are because they've adapted. So it gets a little fuzzy. What would you say to that?
I agree. And I totally agree with you. And I don't think it's just adaptability, it's also how girls are raised versus boys. And as time progresses, that changes, that has changed, and it will continue to change. But remember, this gender effect thing has a lot to do with, women are more internalizing, men are more externalizing. That is just part of genetics. And so that's the difference between, let's say, estrogen and testosterone. Really, 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 it's that simple. But the bottom line is that, yes, over time, women have learned not to raise their voice, as an example. And so, and that's why I said over time, this is changing. Going into the future, this has changed. How we raise our daughters and sons has changed. But, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was the case that a girl who was struggling with various symptoms would be much less likely to go to the parents and say, I'm having these issues. Or if the parents saw the girl having a harder time making friends, it was less of an issue than if the boy was having the same problems. If a girl failed in math, it was less of an issue than if the boy failed, that kind of thing. So that's why there's always an underdiagnosis of girls, just because there are certain things that are classified as girl traits, and so they seem more acceptable to society.
That makes me just want to throw things. But
Yeah,
other than that,
things have changed, though. I mean, they're very much changing over the course of time, but that's how it is. Yeah.
I hope so. Okay. We have a question here. My oldest son was just diagnosed. He is about to be 5, and we have been waiting for almost 2 years. I also have a 1-year-old. At what point should I have him evaluated? Should I be looking for signs?
But goodness, I'm so sorry that it has taken 2 years. That's just horrible. Yeah, I think it's not a bad idea to be watching out. I know that as a parent, when you have one child who has received a diagnosis, you're automatically going to be looking for red flags. And one is a little bit too young unless you have very extreme signs, I guess, I would say at this point. Things like, for instance, not being able to get a child's eye contact when you call their name. Now, at one, that very basic thing should exist. You should be able to call your child's name and they should look at you. And if that is not happening, that is, for instance, one of the things we classify as a red flag. There are, you can, in fact, there's actually a very good questionnaire called the M-CHAT, M-CHAT, which is a screening questionnaire. So you also need to know the difference. There's diagnostic and then there's screening. And they're quite different. Screening questionnaires do not lead to a diagnosis. Screening questionnaires are the ones that you want in this case because they give you all the red flags. So you look up M-CHAT online. I promise you it's probably there, and you can easily answer the questions on the M-CHAT and score it yourself. It's not hard to score. You have to add some numbers and subtract some numbers, and then you'll see if there's anything to worry about. And I would do that probably every 6 months. And then if you're on the border, like if you're unsure, if things are not becoming very clear to you by the time the child is, let's say, 2.5, I would go and seek a diagnosis at that point.
And can I say, just because nobody told me this, that if your child loses skills, that is not something that you wait and see if they come back.
Yeah, that's very important as well. And that's a big one, of course. And I'm not sure because I'm less engaged with diagnosis. I'm still doing diagnosis, but much less than I used to. And I haven't seen that often. I wonder if it's happening as much regressive.
Really?
But
That would be amazing if that were true, because a few years ago that was like 50% of
yeah,
kids
it
who
was
were
happening a
struggling.
lot. Absolutely agree with that.
Oof.
And it's not necessarily a positive thing, Shannon, if we don't see as much of that. And I'll tell
Okay.
you why. Because if we don't see as much of that, one possible answer is that it is happening so early
Ugh,
that we just don't see. There's
okay.
not enough time for accumulation of skills and then regression. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes, I'm
So,
sorry though. That makes me
very, very nervous either way. But yes, there's a subtype definitely that we see that is kids who, and specifically with parents, it's language. The child has words and they use words. And once you lose words, the next thing is you lose contact, you lose eye contact, you lose a connection. And so it's very, very important to note those types of things and go on immediately. And I say that, but I know parents are struggling so much to get a diagnosis fast. And it's just so upsetting. And, which is why I've dedicated like one day a week, this day, Tuesdays, to doing diagnosis after the show. So yeah, it's very, very upsetting.
Well, that goes right to our next question. They wrote in and said Temple Grandin, because we interviewed her and that played last week. Temple Grandin said that her biggest concern was the lack of diagnosis for kids who are 3 and not speaking. Shannon mentioned on the show last week that you are trying to do something about that. What can you tell us? You sort of just gave us a hint.
Well, I'm trying to build a whole separate, I guess, company around diagnosis because I've been diagnosing for a very long time. And there are a couple of folks who work with me who we've known each other for over 20, almost 30 years. Vince Redmond, who a lot of our folks know, and Evelyn Kong, who a lot of our viewers know. The three of us have done diagnosis for a long time, and Vince and Evelyn are helping me, and we're looking at how we can potentially do that as a completely separate thing. We're just now starting, and as I said, what we're doing is we have a lot of people who are requesting a diagnosis coming in, and we are focusing on the younger children first because there's such a need to get them into treatment as soon as possible. So we are trying to do that. And it doesn't take us very long to do a diagnosis. It takes a couple of hours for each child. So it is possible for us to do, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 a week. It's definitely not enough. I was very fortunate that I got my it's called an e-passport, where I am licensed. I was originally licensed, as you know, Shannon, in a bunch of states as a psychologist. This is not my BCBA license, my other life. And now I'm licensed pretty much across the US through this e-passport thing. There's only a couple of states that I'm not licensed in. So we can actually do this for kids across the country. And we're really focusing on trying to help the very young folks who are just like the individual who just wrote in and said, I've been waiting 2 years, my child is 5. That's insane because those 2 years are very important years for the child to get help. So we're doing the best we can. I have met with a lot of folks who have developed technology for diagnosis. For instance, there's early tech. There's a lot of different types of technology that are just basically a kit is sent to you at home. The parent videotapes the child in certain settings, and then that's sent back to the physician. But those types of things I don't really need because I've been diagnosing for a really long time. But there are things that are developing to help reduce this delay in diagnosis across the country. As you can imagine, it's every time this prevalence goes up, which again it just went up, it's crazy. It's just there's not enough people diagnosing accurately, and it definitely needs to happen more.
I want to say hi to Tiny Shrunk Girl. I always love when people have cool names. So, hello to you as well. And I want to acknowledge that Carl wrote in and said children losing language before 4 should be considered a mental health emergency. Carl, yes, I agree with you. I wish I had known that because when I went to the pediatrician when my child lost language, she told me it was that I was a late in life mother and that boys talk later. Um, and that he would be talking in paragraphs when he turned 2.
Yeah.
Uh, that's still a psychic wound for me that I listened to her. I want to get to one last question because I think it's pivotal. People want to know, what do you recommend parents do while waiting for a diagnosis?
That's a great question. I would uh, probably do a couple of different things. It's so hard for me to put that hat on because I just recognize the symptoms so early. But I guess if I was a parent who wasn't sure, so that means you're waiting for diagnosis because you're not sure. I would,
No, I think it's because they're on a waiting list.
yeah, right. And the only reason you're seeking out a diagnosis is because you don't know, you're not sure, right?
No,
So,
I think they're seeking a diagnosis so that they can get the help, but it's a
right,
group, right? So I
right. But if
I
you
think a lot of parents are fairly sure, but they
don't,
still can't do anything.
yeah, so that's a whole different that's a different perspective as well. I just don't know. Most of the parents I see at diagnosis are unsure of
Really?
what's happening with their child. So, and maybe it's because it's wishful thinking, right? You just kind of don't want to. But what I would say is the first phase, if you're unsure, I would do what I just told the other viewer, which is get online, get a chat, do a screening tool, which you can do yourself. And then that will kind of one way or another let you know where you're headed. If you are at risk, which the unchat is a screening tool, so it'll tell you if your child's at risk. If you are at risk, then there's a lot of things you can do to kind of get started. The first thing I would do is I would educate myself on not necessarily on autism. I mean, it's very important actually to get an education on autism. I'd be reading every possible thing that exists out there because there's an aspect of autism that has to do with making sure you don't ignore the health of the child. So when you assume if you do the screening that you already have a diagnosis, and what would you do next? Educate yourself, understand what it means. Is there a diet you need to do that might help? Is your child sleeping well? Are there other things you need to do to make sure your child is in their absolute best place in regards to learning? Because the next thing that's going to happen is a lot of teaching to try to catch your child up or to figure out ways where your child can learn, because clearly they didn't learn the typical way. So that means you need to educate yourself on ABA and the applied behavior analysis, which is the only thing that is 100% covered right now by health insurance and is supposed to be the treatment of choice right now. So what you need to do is learn about ABA. And don't go in listening to people's opinions, just learn, read about it, learn, go on websites. Like we have a new program that's called Neurodivergent Parenting, which is a really good program to train parents. Look online, read what you can, go on our other program, obviously Skills, teaches you a lot about the different types of things that your child might be deficient in or needing help and support in. Educate yourself as much as you can during this time that you're waiting and start to really observe and track and list the areas that your child needs support in and try to start finding those resources even before the diagnosis. Now, a lot of ABA providers, for example, are not going to accept a child until they have a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that you can't get on their wait list or you can't have made contact, can't have research the providers around you and select the one that you feel more comfortable with so that you're ready to go. This is really important because when you get that diagnosis, you don't want to have another 2-year wait period. You want to be ready to go so that you can get your child in the services right away.
Of course, I was muted. Sorry. And we're out of time. We have to let you go because I know you have so many things pressing you. But thank you so much for being here and elucidating all of this because it's dense. And I think that a lot of times, it's just it is a gate preventing our loved ones from getting to help, real help, right away. So I thank you so much. We've got a great guest tomorrow, you guys, talking about a company that they work for called Neurotalent, because we're really looking at making sure that for those of you who are ready to work, that you can get access to work, right? It's a very interesting landscape right now, and they're going to talk about that. So make sure that you join us tomorrow. But thank you, Dr. Granpeesheh, as always. Your
Thank
brilliant mind, so helpful to us. We'll be back tomorrow. Until then, give your kiddos a hug from me and one for you too. Bye-bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Don't forget, you can watch Ask Dr. Doreen live every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We hope to see you there.